All right, so introduction. Ecosystems are constantly changing. So forests, sometimes you have forests that were once on empty lake beds. Um, so if you can see here, this is a lake bed, and that lake bed got filled in, and then it gets later on it would get filled in with a forest. That would be an example. You could have a tree that falls. So if you upper bottom right hand corner, you see a tree fell and allows more sunlight to hit the floor. And then those seeds that need the light, that signals them to start to germinate. So typically in soil, especially in a forest or any soil, you could have hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds in there, just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. And when the right conditions present themselves, they'll germinate and grow. When the right conditions are not there, then they won't germinate. They'll wait for the right conditions. Nature is very, very patient. It could wait a long time before it can before it will react. And then you have over here, the bottom left here picture is a vacant lot, and you can see it's already starting to grow in. So nature always finds a way to prevail, and that's the basic theme for this. And humans have done a lot of damage, but if we have a hands off, nature can bounce back pretty quickly a lot of times. We just have to kind of let nature do what it does best. And sometimes it's just a matter of getting rid of that egocentric attitude that humans have, that we can control nature and subdue it. And better, in some cases we can, but the best way to do it is to become a partner with nature and not a adversary of it. All right, talk about ecological succession. So this is the gradual process of change and replacement of all or some species in a community. And this can take a few years, it could take hundreds of years, or it could take thousands of years, depending on the severity of the damage and how quickly they need to recover. So here we have an illustration, a picture of American beech trees, and they are they are a staple. I said stable, but I should have said staple of most deciduous forests. So the American beech trees are a common tree that you would see in deciduous forests throughout North America, and they create this staple. And this represents the climax of a forest. Now, this is exactly what land wants to end up becoming. This is the end all, because the trees are going to keep any of the smaller stuff from growing because they shade out everything. And so all land will end up wanting to look something like this picture. And it will if you let it. Primary succession. So we talked about the difference between primary and secondary succession. Primary occurs when areas that did not support life previously. That could be on sand dunes, it could be on lava flows, it could be on rocky areas. And so the illustrations that I have here, and you can see the primary succession of sand dunes. So here we have the sand, and then you start to see some sea oats that are growing around the sand. And then here we have rocks. And the rocks, they are already starting to grow lichen. We're going to talk about lichen in a little bit, and how they play an important role in succession. And then here we have our primary succession. We start with bare rocks, and then we have small plants, and then and as you can see here, as slowly each time the sand and there's less rock and more soil that starts to grow until there's enough soil and enough nutrients to grow trees, and then we have reached the apex of succession. Secondary succession occurs whenever you have, and like I said in the illustration before, is whenever you have some type of a disaster that occurs, and they had life on the land previously, an established ecosystem, some disaster, forest fire, earthquake, floods, what have you, clear cutting the forest, and then it will start to regrow, and the regrowth is known as secondary succession, because it was already established, something happened, and then it regrew, and so that's what makes it secondary succession as opposed to primary succession. Now, in any type of succession, well, typically in primary succession, but sometimes it can occur in secondary succession, you're going to have the first species to colonize an uninhabited area are going to be lichen and bacteria. And here are different illustrations of different types of lichen. They can be very colorful. So this one, you have the upper left corner, you have the orange lichen, and then here you can have various other stages of lichen also. Now let's talk a little bit more about lichen. Lichens are actually composed of two different species, and they form a symbiotic relationship. You have the fungus, and then you have green algae. So the algae is what's going to do the photosynthesis. Now this is photosynthesis, and so it produces the food for both the fungus and the algae. It produces enough food for both of them, the sugars and what have you. The fungus is going to go through and mine and basically etch through the rock. It can pull minerals from and sand, and it can also hold water. So therefore it keeps the algae moist even in drier conditions, and it provides essential minerals and nutrients that the algae are going to need to do their photosynthesis and create the sugars and food that both of them need. So it forms a symbiotic relationship, and they also represent the first and the pioneer type of species and organisms that will occupy an ecosystem if you're starting with something like just bare rock or lava flows. So here is, a kind of rundown. So you've got your bare rock, and then the lichen is going to attach to the bare rock, and it's going to break it down. You will have some water that's going to, you'll have little cracks that were caused by the lichen, and water can seep in there. And then during the wintertime, if there's water in there, it will freeze. And water has a tendency of expanding when it freezes and causing bigger rocks. After a while, the lichen is going to die and leave its remains in the rocks and create soil. Mosses can also increase the breakup and also die. And then each process, you're developing organic soil. And when enough organic soil starts to form, then you're going to get grasses and small plants. It grows, the soil grows even more, then you can start to have shrubs. And then finally, when you get trees to start to grow, then you start to make a forest. And once you get to your forest place, you have the apex of all of this, and then you have an established system. So you can also have primary succession or succession in urban areas. So here we have a vacant lot, and as you can see, this is a time lapse of a vacant lot. And so you see the concrete that's here, and you can start to see some of the pioneer plants that are growing between the cracks of the concrete. And these pioneering plants are going to have roots. The roots are going to grow. The growth of the roots are going to cause the cracks to grow even more. Those plants are going to die and leave their organic matter, and then more stuff is going to start to grow. And so this is 3 years after being abandoned. The next one is 3 to 10 years, and then you're going to start to increase. The vegetation is going to start to get a little bit bigger. You're going to have less annuals and more perennials. You're going to start to get bushes that are going to grow, and they're going to start to get even bigger. After about 10 to 50 years, the bushes are going to get bigger, and you might even get some small trees and even more vegetation. After 10 years, you're going to start that vacant lot that started out looking like this is going to end up looking more like this, and it's going to start to look more like a forest. And by that time, most of the concrete or asphalt would have been broken up and non-recognizable. It's going to resemble a lot more like a forest than it would a vacant lot. And this is an example of what nature can do if you just leave it alone and let it do the thing that it does best. Secondary succession, that's going to occur within, after an established ecosystem, forest fire happens. Year one, you're going to have some annual plants. Annual plants, the difference between annuals and perennials. Annuals, they only exist for 1 year, 1 season, and then they die. They leave their seeds, and then they grow for the next season, and so on and so forth. So they don't have a very long life cycle. The plants don't have a very long life cycle, but they are pioneers. They can grow very quickly. That's why typically your annual plants are going to be your pioneering plants. The next year, you're going to start to get more perennials, and the perennials, what the difference is that they're going to live for at least 2 years or more, and they can live year after year. And they don't necessarily die. They don't die off. They'll die off after their complete life cycle is over, and they can produce seeds and fruit and stuff for many years to come. Then you have shrubs, more perennials, and then after that you can start to have smaller trees, and then and a lot of times you'll have conifers, and then after that you can have a mature forest with a lot more of the deciduous or the leaf type plants and trees, and you have a mature, with oak and maple and beech and more of the broadleaf leaves. Have your mature forest that grows back. Climax community. This is when a community has reached its apex. In other words, it's not going to change very much. It has a lot of the perennials, and it could change, but the changes will be very slight, and as long as it remains undisturbed, it's not going to change very much. So, and you have different climax communities for different biomes. So a forest could look something like this. A desert, unless you start getting more rainfall, the desert climax community could look like this. Grasslands, you're going to have grasslands, and then coral reefs, and each one of them, each biome has its own climax community. And once they reach that point, they're not going to change very much.